January 897 AD. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, Pope Stephen VI sits on his throne, presiding over a trial. Across from him, propped up in a chair and dressed in full papal vestments, sits another pope, Pope Formosus, who has been dead for 9 months. His corpse, partially decomposed, stinking, held upright by attendants, is about to be prosecuted for crimes against the Church. A deacon stands beside the rotting body, tasked with speaking for the deceased. Witnesses are called, charges are read, the dead pope is asked to defend himself. And when he fails to respond, he is found guilty. This isn't medieval propaganda. This isn't legend. This actually happened. It's called the Cadaver Synod, and it's one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. But here's what makes it truly chilling. Pope Stephen wasn't insane. He was calculating. And what he did to that corpse was the logical conclusion of a power struggle that had consumed Rome for decades. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a pope would desecrate his predecessor's body in front of hundreds of witnesses. You'll see how the most powerful institution in Europe could descend into such grotesque theater, and you'll realize that this wasn't about religion at all. It was about power, and what people will do to keep it. To understand why Stephen dug up Formosus, you need to understand that by the late 800s, the papacy wasn't a spiritual office, it was a political prize. Rome in the 9th century was a war zone. The unified empire of Charlemagne had fractured. Italy was carved up between rival noble families, each vying for control. And the papacy, which crowned emperors and held vast territories, was the ultimate trophy. Popes weren't chosen by divine inspiration or even by the Church. They were installed by whichever Roman noble family had the most soldiers that week. Pontiffs were routinely bribed, threatened, imprisoned, and murdered. Some lasted years, others lasted days. Between 872 and 904 AD, just 32 years, there were 16 different popes. That's an average tenure of 2 years. Several were violently deposed. At least 3 were murdered. This is the world into which Pope Formosus ascended in 891 AD. Formosus wasn't a nobody. He'd been Bishop of Porto, a powerful position, and had served as a papal legate, essentially a diplomatic troubleshooter for previous popes. He was educated, politically savvy, and ambitious, but he'd also made enemies. Powerful enemies. The dominant force in Roman politics at this time was the Spoleto family, Italian nobles who controlled vast territories and had their own vision for who should rule the fractured empire. Formosus opposed them. Instead, he supported a rival, Arnulf of Carinthia, a German king who claimed to be Charlemagne's legitimate heir. This wasn't a theological disagreement. This was a choice between 2 armed camps, 2 visions of European power. And Formosus bet on the wrong side. In 896 AD, Formosus died. Natural causes, as far as we know. He was buried with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica, as popes were. His pontificate was over. Or so it seemed. But Guy III of Spoleto, the man Formosus had opposed, wasn't satisfied with simply outliving his enemy. He wanted revenge, and he had the perfect puppet to carry it out. Stephen VI became pope in May 896 AD, just weeks after Formosus died. He wasn't elected by any meaningful process. He was installed by the Spoleto faction as their man in Rome. His job was simple: legitimize their power, delegitimize their enemies, and erase Formosus's legacy. Stephen was probably in his 40s, a Roman by birth, and had been Bishop of Anagni before his elevation. Historical records tell us almost nothing about his personality, but his actions speak volumes. He was either a true believer in the Spoleto cause, or he was terrified of what they'd do to him if he didn't comply. Either way, by January 897, Stephen was ready to do something no pope had ever done before. He ordered Formosus's tomb opened. The body, 9 months dead, in various stages of decomposition, was exhumed, stripped of its burial shroud, and redressed in full papal regalia. The triple crown, the sacred vestments, everything that marked him as Christ's vicar on earth. Then it was dragged into the Lateran Basilica and propped up on a throne. Imagine the scene: the largest church in Christendom, hundreds of clergy, nobles, and officials in attendance, candles burning, incense failing to mask the smell of decay. And in the center of it all, a corpse sitting in judgment. Stephen VI, living and breathing, took his seat opposite the dead pope and began the trial. The charges against Formosus were numerous, but they boiled down to two main accusations. First, that Formosus had violated church law by moving from one bishopric, Porto, to become Bishop of Rome, the Papacy. Canon law at the time theoretically prohibited bishops from transferring between sees. It was seen as a form of spiritual adultery, abandoning one bride for another. This charge was transparently political. Plenty of popes had done the same thing, but it gave Stephen a legalistic veneer for the spectacle. Second, and more seriously, Formosus was accused of perjury and of conspiring against the Spoleto family by crowning Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor in 896 AD, just months before Formosus's death. The trial followed formal procedures, which somehow made it more grotesque. Stephen addressed the corpse directly, asking it to respond to the charges. When predictably Formosus didn't answer, a deacon was assigned to speak on his behalf. We don't know what the deacon said. Historical accounts don't preserve the defense, but it didn't matter. The outcome was predetermined. Witnesses testified against the dead pope. Documents were read. Canon law was cited. Stephen delivered passionate speeches about Formosus's treachery, his ambition, his crimes against God and church. And then came the verdict: guilty. The punishment was comprehensive and brutal in its symbolism. First, all of Formosus's papal acts were declared null and void. Every ordination he'd performed, every bishop he'd consecrated, every decree he'd issued erased. Hundreds of clergy across Europe suddenly found their positions illegitimate, their authority voided by a dead man's conviction. Second, the papal vestments were stripped from the corpse in front of the assembly. The sacred garments that marked papal authority were torn away, leaving the decomposing body in the clothes of a common priest. Third, and this is where it becomes truly medieval, the three fingers of the right hand that Formosus had used to give blessings were cut off. Finally, the body was cast out. It was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River. The message was clear. Formosus had never been pope. His reign was a lie, and even in death, he deserved no dignity. But Rome wasn't having it. The Cadaver Synod was too much, even for a city accustomed to political violence and papal intrigue. Public opinion turned sharply against Stephen VI. The spectacle of a rotting corpse on trial felt less like justice and more like desecration, a violation of something sacred, even in that brutal age. Riots broke out. The people who'd supported Stephen started backing away, and within months, his political protection evaporated. In the summer of 897 AD, just months after the trial, Stephen VI was deposed in a popular uprising. He was stripped of his papal vestments, imprisoned, and shortly after, strangled to death in his cell. His reign had lasted barely 15 months. But the chaos didn't end there. The Cadaver Synod had opened a can of worms that Rome couldn't close. Stephen's successor, Pope Theodore II, immediately reversed the verdict. He had Formosus's body retrieved from the Tiber. It had reportedly washed ashore and been secretly preserved by supporters and reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. Then came Pope John IX, who convened a new council that formally rehabilitated Formosus, declared the Cadaver Synod invalid, and forbade any future trials of the dead. But the political factions weren't done. Another pope, Sergius III, later declared the Cadaver Synod valid again. For decades, Rome oscillated between pro-Formosus and anti-Formosus factions, each new pope reversing his predecessor's position. The corpse of Pope Formosus became the most contested political football in Europe. So what was the Cadaver Synod actually about? On the surface, it was about canon law, about the legitimacy of papal succession, about theological questions of authority. But strip away the religious language and you see something simpler and darker. It was about erasing the past to control the present. By declaring Formosus's papacy void, Stephen VI and the Spoleto faction accomplished several things. They delegitimized Arnulf of Carinthia's claim to the empire. Since his coronation by Formosus was now invalid, they cast doubt on every bishop and priest Formosus had ordained, creating a dependency on the new regime to re-legitimize them. And they sent a message to anyone who might oppose the Spoletos: "We will destroy you, even after you're dead." This wasn't religion. It was political theater, using religious symbols. And it worked briefly, until it backfired catastrophically. The Cadaver Synod revealed the essential vulnerability of any institution that derives its authority from claims of divine sanction. When you politicize the sacred, you destroy its power. By turning the papacy into such an obvious tool of factional warfare, Stephen VI damaged the very authority he was trying to wield. For decades after, the papacy struggled to regain legitimacy. This period is sometimes called the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy, when popes were the puppets of Roman noble families and the office descended into murderous chaos. It would take more than a century and dramatic reforms before the papacy could reclaim its spiritual authority. If you think this is just medieval madness with no modern relevance, consider what the Cadaver Synod actually demonstrates: the logic of total political war. When opposing a living enemy isn't enough, you attack their legacy, you erase their accomplishments, you declare that they never should have existed, you make their very existence illegitimate. We see this pattern throughout history: Stalin airbrushing purged officials from photographs, damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome, where emperors' names were chiseled from monuments. Modern cancel culture, whatever you think of the term, operates on similar principles, not just opposing someone's ideas, but erasing their platform, their influence, their place in the discourse. The Cadaver Synod is an extreme version, yes, but the impulse is recognizable. When you hate someone enough, defeating them isn't sufficient. You need them to have never been legitimate in the first place. And here's the disturbing part: it sometimes works. If Stephen VI had maintained power, if the Spoleto faction had won their broader political war, Formosus might genuinely have been erased from legitimate papal history. Future generations would have been taught that his papacy was a fraud, a usurpation, a mistake to be forgotten. History, as they say, is written by the victors. The Cadaver Synod was an attempt to write someone out of history entirely. It failed, but only because Stephen lost power before he could make it stick. So what do we learn from a pope putting a corpse on trial in 897 AD? First, institutions are only as sacred as people agree they are. The papacy commanded respect because people believed it represented divine authority. But when popes became obvious political puppets, that authority evaporated. Sacred is a consensus, not a fact, and consensus can break. Second, political revenge has no logical endpoint. It wasn't enough for the Spoletos to defeat Formosus politically. It wasn't enough that he died. They needed to humiliate him posthumously, to delegitimize his very existence. When politics becomes about total annihilation, rather than competing interests, everything becomes a weapon, even corpses. Third, spectacle can backfire. Stephen VI thought the trial would demonstrate power and legitimacy. Instead, it revealed desperation and barbarism. Sometimes, the most dramatic displays of authority are actually signs of weakness. The Cadaver Synod didn't strengthen Stephen's position, it destroyed it. The body of Pope Formosus was dug up, tried, convicted, mutilated, and thrown in a river. Then it was retrieved, reburied with honors, and turned into a saint by some and a villain by others, depending on which faction held power that decade. In the end, both Stephen and Formosus became footnotes in papal history, overshadowed by the grotesque spectacle they created together, one as victim, one as prosecutor. The Cadaver Synod stands as a monument to how far institutions can fall when power becomes the only value that matters, and how even the dead aren't safe when the living have scores to settle. This is just one chapter in Rome's darkest century, when popes were murdered, poisoned, and imprisoned at the whims of noble families fighting for control of Europe. If you want more stories from the shadows of the old world, where history is stranger and darker than any legend, subscribe to Occult Europe, because the past isn't dead. Sometimes, it's literally on trial.